Good evening. It's Grant Cameron here with another show, and I got a big show today. On the 22nd, 23rd, 24th of this month, I'm going to be at the Alien Cosmic Expo, and on the 30th of this month, I'm going to be in Vancouver at the Architects of the New Paradigm. And my guest today is going to be there with me, and I'd like to sort of introduce Richard Dolan, and we should cut it a little short because we're on KGRA radio, and if people don't know who Richard Dolan is, they're probably on the wrong station. Richard's one of the leading researchers, historian. He's done 2 books on the disclosure subject, UFOs and national security state. AD After Disclosure, another book. He runs Richard Dolan Press, puts out a number of books, including one of the books I did a few years back. He's got a show on Gaia. He's got a radio show on KGRA, and he's been there, done that. So I'd like you to welcome Richard to the show. How you doing, Richard?
Hi, Grant. Hey, it's great to be on your show.
Yeah, super. And it's great to have you on. It's a hot time in the field, and I guess we're going to be discussing the latest goings on. But first, I would like to congratulate you on your marriage. And my first question is going down that road.
Thank you, by the way.
Yes. My question to you is, as you know, I have Desta who helps me do some stuff. The odd time she and I will travel to conferences, and we're in the middle of nowhere here, so it takes us like 20 hours to drive anywhere. And usually after about 8 hours, it gets so hot and heavy with the conversation that it's almost time to pull over and call the cops. So my question to you is, have you and Tracy ever had a situation where you're having one of these Bohr Einstein debates upon the nature of reality? Because is she a remote viewer or an intuitive? How would you define her?
Tracy, first of all, is absolutely just one of a kind, in my opinion. She is a professionally trained remote viewer and very good, very good. At some point, you or I or both or other people as well will want to interview her about this because so Paul Elder was her trainer. Paul Elder is an instructor and trainer at the Monroe Institute right now and has been for many years. He's absolutely world renowned. He trained Tracy, and she for a number of years did multiple remote views per week on outbound targets frequently. So that's like targets could be 1,000 miles away or more. So she was doing high level and really well documented remote views on a regular basis and became really, really excellent at it. So now, is she an intuitive as well? I would probably say yes. That's a harder thing to measure, but yes, absolutely. I mean, that's a very, very big part. She's an experiencer. She's like all of, you and she, of course, did a YouTube interview back when we were at the Ozark conference, and you had the right brain, left brain discussion with her. Mm-hmm. And in my view, she's just a classic right brain intuitive experience. Oh, she's very logical. She's got a very, it's not like she's just out there with no logical ideas. She's got a lot of them. She's a great communicator. But yeah, I would say she's intuitive and a remote viewer. And as far as arguments, I don't really think we have those. We have great conversations every day. Uh-huh. So we're constantly kind of going back and forth about the nature of reality as we see it. I mean, the fact is that I don't really have any disagreements with the things that she can do. It's things that I've incorporated into my worldview for a long time now. So the big thing that I try to do in understanding this crazy world of ours is to incorporate what I try to understand logically about the world, and that is what I try to understand in terms of factual evidence. What can I defend publicly to the world about the subject of UFOs and beyond? And then recognizing that there are elements about our world that are very hard to nail down scientifically, but they're still there. And so there's got to be, we have to have some nuance, in my view, in how we understand reality, and not just say this is black, this is white. There are areas where, in my view, our minds are still kind of working our way through, and so we have to be sort of forgiving with ourselves in terms of dogmatism, I guess is how I would put it. So, but to answer your question, I think that I don't think we've really had a big argument at all over the nature of reality. I think what we have are really excellent conversations.
Yeah. What has changed in terms of, say, view on consciousness, that aspect coming into it after you met her?
That's a good question. It's not like I was ever this hardcore nuts and bolts kind of person. I mean, even long before I did UFOs, I've studied philosophy my whole life. It's always been a very, very important part of my my thinking, which is to try to understand the nature of what paradigms are and how our paradigms are, in a sense, a construction of our form of consciousness at that particular time. And but I've always had a view of reality also that is one in which there is this thing out there called truth. There is a truth. So truth isn't entirely, in my view anyway, what I think it is. It's not an entirely subjective thing. I mean, otherwise I don't think people would have arguments over what happened on 9/11, for example, because implicit in such types of debates is that there's an objective reality. It's there. And we believe that there's an objective reality because otherwise we wouldn't be arguing over what it is. So I've always believed that there's a reality that's independent of whatever it is I think about it. And so that's part of it. But on the other hand, I guess what I would say is that over the years, and in particular, being with Tracy, I recognize that it's very difficult to quantify someone's subjective experience, but it doesn't invalidate it. Subjective experiences happen all the time to us. And I guess what I would say is I've become more careful, in my view, as how I will treat subjective forms of evidence. But I'm still at a point where I don't simply accept what someone says, completely simply because they say it happened. I'm sorry, I just can't go there. There are too many people who just have lost credibility, in my opinion, over the years, and I just can't. I mean, there's people in this world, Grant, that if I were standing in a hot burning desert with them and they were to say, "Oh, it's a sunny day out," I'd be looking for rain clouds. So I don't just believe everyone.
Yeah.
But I do recognize that people have experiences that are hard to quantify, but they still happen. And so that's a really important part of us trying to understand this UFO phenomenon. And I know you feel very strongly about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this comes down to belief versus knowing. How much, you mentioned 9/11. So say 9/11, the UFO mystery, how much is going to end up becoming knowledge as compared to the various beliefs? Because, you can bring up any subject and it's basically like, whatever church and whatever Kool-Aid someone's drinking, it's a different view. It's almost like consciousness itself, that we can't really nail anything really down in terms of, especially like paranormal fields. Yeah,
I agree. I sometimes occasionally will follow the arguments of, sometimes they're called the brain wars, by these neurologists, and they'll talk about consciousness. And what you find in that field is that all those guys, most of them anyway, are such hardcore materialists. Like a lot of them will just argue there's no such thing as consciousness anyway. It's like it's an illusion, and it's all brain chemistry and neurons and electrons and electrical transmissions. And I'm like, my God, man, like those are some of the scariest people out there, in my opinion. A, they're wrong. I mean, I'm not a neurologist, but I'm just going to say they're wrong. B, I think a lot of them are actually really dangerous because it's almost as if, like, because they deny consciousness, they deny things like the soul. It's like you go down a slippery slope of morality and ethics where almost anything can be justified. And I never want to go down that road. But in general, I think consciousness, I know I've heard you say this a few times recently, and I think I completely agree with you, which is that consciousness is a key, maybe you would say the key to understanding what is going on in the UFO subject. I guess what I would simply say is I would qualify it by saying it's one of the keys. And I would still argue that we need a lot of objective data from around the world to fill in this picture. But to understand what's happening, we have to listen to those people who are having experiences. And then, if you go over like 70 years, 60, 70 years of stories of experiences, making sense out of it. I mean, some of this stuff is really strange, and how to form a coherent pattern is maybe one of the biggest issues that I have these days.
Do you think that the phenomena is making it stranger, or do you think it's trying to help resolve it, or is it?
Oh God!
Because you get this trickster idea that George Hansen brings up, and that it's almost like they're playing with us, sort of dragging us from one breadcrumb to the next.
I really agree with that. George Hansen, by the way, I'm glad you mentioned him. He's someone in this field who is not well enough known, in my view. Very, very brilliant guy. Another one who brought this up with me a few years ago was, oh my God, I'm drawing a complete blank, and I know him so well. He did all the books on the cattle mutilations. Co-hosted Gene Steinberg's Paracast. Chris O'Brien.
Chris O'Brien, yeah.
Chris, if you're listening, I'm so sorry. He's a great guy and smart. And Chris O'Brien once said to me that not only are so many of these elements of the UFO phenomenon seemingly contradictory or seemingly, leading in different directions, but they often seem to contradict themselves, like the different explanations of what we're dealing with. Are we dealing with an extraterrestrial hypothesis? Are we dealing with an interdimensional hypothesis? Are we dealing with time travelers? Are we dealing with black budget? Because there's all of these different ways we can try to explain, right, what this phenomenon is. And in his opinion, they not only led in different directions depending on what case you're looking at, but he felt that they contradicted each other in various points. And so there's this trickster phenomenon going on. And it really makes me wonder about this hypothesis people call the simulation hypothesis.
Yeah.
You ever follow this?
Yeah.
Yeah, like I think that there's a lot to it. And it's frustrating to me because I can't prove it. It may be inherently unprovable. I don't know. But the idea that we're all being played essentially like a big video game or in some simulation by some super intelligent entity that's created this reality. And in my view, that may be one of the only things that explains some of the odd synchronicities that people report, because it seems to go beyond straight up causality, like a Newtonian mechanistic universe for sure, where causality itself is open to question. And honestly, the further down this road I go in this field and in life, the more difficult it is for me to just nail down like what I think reality is. I think it's a very, very complex thing. And this phenomenon that you and I and so many other people study is a gateway into understanding some of those complexities. But I have a long way to go before I really figure out what I think.
You've been at this for a couple of decades, I guess now.
Yep.
Have you run up against this bizarre nature of the phenomena, like whether it's a sighting, synchronicity, or have you been sort of dragged into this, or are you able to sort of sit on the sidelines and watch?
I was dragged in absolutely dragged in. So when I started researching this in the early 90s, 93 and 94 were the years that I really started. And at that time, it's so funny, I think back, I was still in the academic world, and my whole world, and this, you've done this too, was just documents, history, historical documents, and nailing down concrete facts. It's all of us.
Yeah.
And I stumbled onto the UFO topic at that time, and for me, it was a really simple thing. It was purely intellectual. It was no experience like what you had years ago. I just wanted, on an intellectual basis, to know, is this a thing? Is this a real thing, as people have claimed, or is it absent from our history, as academics seem to treat it? What's the story? I didn't like having a big question mark hanging over my head on something that I thought was, something that people talked about all the time. There was always this talk of a UFO cover-up, even in the early 90s. And I thought, I'm just going to resolve this, because here I am studying the world of 1950, late 1940s. And I thought I would take a few months out of my life, honestly. I thought that's all it would take for me to resolve. and that turned into 25 years. And through that, so I started out as ultra nuts and bolts in my form of research. My first book, UFOs and the National Security State, came out in 2000 originally. And it was, I'm still very proud of that book. It was a careful, as careful as I can make it, a historical narrative. And I used to say back in those days, all the time, I said, I don't even care. I don't care what other people think. I don't even care what I think. All I care about is what the data can show me about this phenomenon. And I said that all the time. But what I learned pretty quickly on, like by 01, 02, 03, I was already looking into things like remote viewing, for instance, because...
Oh, is that right?
And I was. In fact, I started a correspondence back in those early years with Hal Puthoff, with Ingo Swann. I spent an evening in the home of Ingo Swann back in, I think it was 2002 or so. Joe McMoneagle I talked with back then, Lynn Buchanan, Russell Targ. Like I knew all those folks way back then, and was trying to understand. I got into remote viewing because I learned that a lot of these remote viewers, psychic spies hired by the CIA and the U.S. Army, were not only accurate in the things that they were seeing relating to like Soviet submarines and the like, but they were seeing, every one of them were seeing extraterrestrials. And that's what got my attention. And I thought, well, I'd like to know more about this. And so early on, I started to ask myself, well, how is it even possible that such a thing like remote viewing can work? Like how is it possible in the structure of our reality, the fabric of reality, that a human being can see something thousands of miles away, or even more interesting, perhaps, in another time, because that happened. Mm-hmm. So what does that say about the nature of space and time? And well, then I started asking physicists. I talked to Puthoff about this. He studies physics. And you learn about what Big Bang physics will tell you. That, like, a Big Bang physicist won't say that there was a big explosion in space. No. When I was a kid, that's what I always thought. Big explosion in space. No. The Big Bang was the creation of space and of time. Yeah. And that's when my brain just goes poof, like I can't handle that. But that's the truth, apparently. So that means time and space have a point of origin. They're finite in a sense. That means, in theory, as I visualize it, one could step outside of space and time. What's that? Well, I don't know. That's timelessness. That's spacelessness. And I think I early on decided in my own unscientific manner that somehow remote viewers and other psychics were stepping outside of that space-time reality that we normally inhabit. I don't know how else I could visualize it. And then I asked, well, what part of us a person can do that? And I thought, well, ancient people had a word for it. They called it the soul, as good a word as any. Uh-huh. And so from early on, so my study of UFOs got me into some of these more fringy subjects. As a public person in the field, for a long, long time, I felt very, very constrained from going full on into some of into the fringe, I guess I could say, because I always felt like I had a position that I wanted to defend in this field publicly, and I didn't want to expose myself. I mean, UFOs are tough enough, it's like Rodney Dangerfield. They don't get no respect. And, and I didn't want to amplify that by going into yet more and more fringe. But the problem is, of course, that this is what reality is. That's just how it is. And after a certain while, you just have to make a decision, and you decide, am I going to talk about this or not? And how will I talk about it, and so on. So I feel like I've been dragged inch by inch over the years into consciousness and into the unprovable, and then being with Tracy for the last 2 years, and now we're married. I'm like, look, the world knows that I'm married to a remote viewer. Just put it out there. Yeah. So I have no problem discussing any of this now, but I still will maintain that, people who have highly subjective claims, like, they just can't expect someone like me anyway, just to say, oh yes, I believe every word you say. Like, can't do that. So I need something. And this goes with, not even so much people who have psychic phenomena, but people who like the whistleblowers that are out there, who will make claims based on zero evidence. I mean, no evidence, and they just expect people to accept it. And I think that's a bad habit.
Okay, so what do you think about like the free study where you got 4,000 experiencers and you get these sort of bizarre patterns where, 37% have had near-death experiences, 42% have had downloads, 40% said at one point they knew the answer to everything in the universe. I mean, that would be like a study in drug study, like take this drug, how do you feel,
Yeah.
what's happening. Do you deal with the free study? Have you written anything about it?
I haven't written about it. I've known about it for a while, and I'm so glad that they've done this study, and I consider it very valuable. Like, that's really important information. This is the kind of research that people need to continue doing, honestly. So I think, I take those conclusions very seriously, and I have no reason to doubt the objectivity of how that was done or the methodology. I mean, I'm just going on the assumption that they did it right. So yeah, like the whole idea of downloads.
Yeah. And they've sort of tied it all, like I always describe it like supposedly the CIA called it phenomenology, that it's all tied together, that it's not just UFOs, it's remote viewing.
Yeah.
It's the whole thing. And one of the things I mentioned on my show last night is it's kind of you brought up remote viewing, a bizarre little idea about remote viewing. If you read Jim Schnabel's book about remote viewing, he describes this case with the DIA where they have in 1988, they're doing the remote viewing thing is in trouble. They want to can the program, and they go to the Senate Intelligence Committee, and they bring in two remote viewers, and they're supposed to sort of prove that this stuff is for real. They give them a target. I think it was Saddam's chemical factory or something to give them a target, and they nail this target. But the people that were in the room is, number one was Cohen, William Cohen, who, as you remember, Steve Greer tells a story that he tried to recover Cooper's video from the 1950s where the lands, this thing where he gave them material there.
Yeah.
And Chris Mellon worked for him in the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Chris Mellon also worked with him when he was the Secretary of Defense. So that's the one guy. There's 4 senators there, and that's the one. And the other 3 are Stevens, Glenn, and Inouye, the same guys that helped get the money for the UFO thing. So you see these tie-ins that these same senators who were working with Reid were back in the 1980s working on remote viewing and providing funding for that.
They're kind of their own little senatorial invisible college.
Yeah, it sort of shows like this is all like when Reid did the ATIP program, he was Senate Intelligence Committee. He was connected to the Senate Intelligence Committee. So you see these subjects are being brought up, whether it's remote viewing or whether it's UFOs, that whether you know it or not, I mean, Senate Intelligence Committee is bringing people in and reviewing this stuff. And that's kind of the highest level of, it's not the House, it's the Senate. It's the big boys.
Yeah. I want to go back to your point about the downloads and the study, because I like the segue that you did, but I just want to make one final point about that, which is that I think what you said, 42% of the experiencers had downloads of one sort or another. So that's an interesting fact, but of course that's a different thing from saying that all downloads are true. Like, we still have to come down to the question, at least I do, of how to characterize someone's downloaded or their alleged downloaded information, and what do I make of it? Are they all, a more interesting question, I don't know if the free study does this, is to compare the quality of those specific downloads or categorize them. Do they fall into certain categories? Do they give contradictory information? Like, for example, if you looked at the history of channeling in the last 50, 60 years, like UFO channeling, I mean, they're not consistent. I mean, they tell totally different kinds of realities. The whole history of Ashtar Command. I did a little bit of a study of that, and through the 50s and 60s and 70s, I mean, they just evolved into totally different types of messages, and it just seems a little unrealistic for me to think that those are all legitimate channeled information. But if they weren't legitimate information, then the question is, what were they? And the answer is, I don't know. Is it something that just comes out of someone's subconscious and they think it's true? They go into another altered state? Maybe.
Yeah.
I think
at least you've got the data where you can review it, because I know they had the 2 at the quantum physics papers. One was a doctor out of New York City, and one was just some ordinary guy, a Latino guy in Florida, and they'd both come up with this paper. And they had been given to Edgar Mitchell and to Rudy Shield to say, okay, does this stuff make sense? I mean, and basically the only thing I was able to determine, because they were sort of off the record type stuff, but was, well, it's not crazy stuff. I mean, it's sort of in the ballpark. They can't really tell, is this the real deal? And that's what I say about this material is, the thing is to study it. Like, people are sort of ignoring it and saying it's anecdotal. It really doesn't mean anything. And I don't care if you give them lie detector tests or whatever you do, but at least talk to these people. If you've got that many people who are doing this, it's prime material that you can grab, and perhaps they actually have, because I wrote this book called Inspired, where I looked at Nobel Prizes. So you look at even the idea of the scientific method came in a dream. The idea of the periodic table came in a dream. Einstein's theory of relativity, when he got the toboggan vision, he said, I knew I had to understand that dream. In fact, you could say, and I would say, that my entire career was based on a meditation upon that dream. Yeah. So you start seeing this kind of stuff, that the potential is so dramatic to sort of get some material. And I guess the problem with free is you don't have the, you got 4,000 experiencers. You just don't have the people to go through that material. Because I asked them about the one with the, I don't know if you followed, I do the one with the people flying the craft. 14% of all experiencers say they've been allowed to fly the craft. And I've got 48 of them that I've talked to or interacted with. And when you ask them, how do you do it? Everybody says exactly the same thing. You use your mind. And so I said to them, I said, well, why don't we look at this? Why don't we send out another survey to these 14% of experiencers? And Ray said, well, the people have all these experiences on the craft. And I said, well, yeah, sure. But when they start flying the craft, and you can actually nail this down, and they're saying it's consciousness driven, don't you think we should look at this? But they really don't have the resources.
I totally agree with you. I completely agree with you. This is, and also, I mean, the data, whatever these people's experiences are, like I agree completely. We should be listening to what they have to say, because there's gold in there. I mean, the idea about dreams, by the way, is really interesting. Tracy and I have been talking about this very, very same thing, and it's great that you wrote that book. The idea of dreams being so significant in the history of human innovation. It's actually really, I don't think people really appreciate it fully enough. So it is very important. So whatever is going on in these downloads or these visions that people have had, we should be paying attention, because there's probably a deep wisdom in at least a lot of it, and some potentially really amazing revolutionary ideas as well. You mentioned Tracy in the beginning of this conversation. I'll just say this. Tracy has the most incredible dreams of anyone that I've ever met in my entire life. I mean, most incredible. She'll have dreams that will describe like seemingly future technology, that she'll wake up, describe it to me, and I'm like, what the hell? What did you just dream? Wow. Like they're unbelievably specific, describing incredibly particular forms of technology. I wish I could think of something off the top of my head. I can't, but she writes them down. So like she's got a whole. Yeah, it's unreal. It's unreal. Like I don't know where she is. She's an alien. She is like my extraterrestrial life. I'm pretty convinced about that.
And that's the thing, is to log them into to view that material, because when you do it, and I have had 2 download experiences, and I think Tracy can probably back this up, is it's not an ordinary dream. It comes with absolute certainty that, like Einstein said,
yes.
I knew I had to understand this dream. He knew it was significant. And that's the part where are they tapped into something? So you can do the study, whether it's channeling or whatever, and you can discount it. But there's really nobody doing any sort of major studies on these people who are walking around saying, I remember one woman showed me at Contact, this is 2 years ago, she showed me her cell phone. It had this paper with all these mathematical formulas. It's like 25 pages long. And I said, oh, yeah, you got that in a download? She said, yeah. And then I said, well, that's pretty cool. And then she said, I'm a secretary. I've never taken science. I went, what? That's like, and then of course I made the mistake of giving her my business card and saying, contact me. And she never did. Oh. But when you get these people walking around, it's just like, just bizarre. I mean,
well, you're right. I mean, that's something you'd want to show a mathematician.
Yeah.
Look this over, please.
Yeah. And then you wonder, are we being led? And that leads us to what I want to make sure we talk about the government. Or, where government, they say, whatever the intelligence behind the phenomenon is, that they may be leading us, guiding us, giving us material, giving us hints or whatever. So let's get to the government. Yeah. Have you seen, did you see Putoff's speech last week? It's been transcribed. Steve Bassett has it.
I just talked to Bassett recently, and he was transcribing. I have not. No, I haven't seen Putoff's speech. I'm absolutely interested in listening to it. Like you, I've known Hal Puttoff for a long time. Had many conversations with him, and my understanding. You can probably explain this to listeners better, because I think it sounds like you've read it. But my understanding is that he really put a lot of information, like very candidly, out there relating to the UFO subject and the extraterrestrial phenomenon.
Yeah, it was pretty revealing, but nothing I really hadn't seen before. Like you talked about the metal, the arts parts thing that Linda had, and the one thing that sort of struck me, and I guess I can sort of get your opinion as to what's really going on, because I've always had the impression that there's really going to be nothing that's absolutely solid, because if they want to disclose, they can stand up and disclose. I mean, Vallée said this in 1985 when he and Hynek were offered an insight on a program and stuff, and he said, "Well, if you've got this material, why don't you just release it? What do you need us to be in this thing?" And they turned it down. And so one of the things I noticed in this speech, and he did it twice, and this is something that I've had a question about, is the whole thing, how this thing started. He's again spinning the story, and I think whether he misunderstands or whatever, that the New York Times broke this story. And I always maintain it was the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico all went on the same day, which I think would be sort of down your alley, that, they're on puppets on a string. Can you do this story for us? And in this presentation, again, he brings up the fact that the New York Times did it. They did this investigative reporting, and that they was followed by the Washington Post, CNN, and stuff. And I'm saying, no, it's the and when you put it together, I think
the Post article came out the following day, if I'm not mistaken, Grant. And the Politico, I think Politico came out. We should check the dates on this.
Yeah.
I thought the New York Times broke it. I think they were first among those three, and Politico absolutely was like right on the heels of it. In fact, Politico had information that the New York Times and the Post did not.
And the Post
and better information.
And the Post, like that, the thing is, they're independent stories. That the Post was shown documents. Politico said when the interview that Bender did with National Public Radio later, he said that his source had told him hinted that there was other programs, CIA and other programs.
Right, exactly.
And so the key is, when you put them together, if you sort of assume that, the Washington Post just sort of imitated the story, they didn't have a story, Politico didn't, that it was a New York Times story, then it's one story. But if you look at it as they all had independent stories, then it's a different thing, because that's the whole big argument that you've been in, I've been in, is this thing is, what the hell's the name of this program? And if you look, the New York Times calls it Advanced Aerospace. If you look at Washington Post, they call it Advanced Aviation. If you look at Politico, they call it Advanced Aviation. So if they're being fed this story, they were fed different names, almost like it was an intentional thing to throw us off and for us to all argue about what's the name of the program. And that they were actually given these names, and they're all using different names on basically the same day.
That's a really good insight, and that actually confirms my own strong feeling about this. Is that, look, I just say to people, and I firmly believe this, that never trust anything coming out of the Washington Post or New York Times. It has nothing to do with right or left wing. That's totally irrelevant. What they are is they are servants and partners, really, to the national security apparatus, and they've done that for years. For decades, they were part of the Operation Mockingbird program, and that's really never stopped. Mockingbird has continued and deepened, in my view. It's not just a CIA media manipulation; it's CIA plus Pentagon, national security manipulation of the media, and it goes on. So as far as the actual name of the program, it's a really good point. And then, of course, I'm sure you're familiar. I interviewed an Australian researcher a couple of months ago, Paul Dean, who talked about another name that he found of the program, and
that was leaked to him.
Advanced Aerospace Weapons, the AAW SAP, Advanced Aerospace.
Right, but he got someone from the Pentagon phoning him, which makes me wonder, like, why are they phoning some guy? It's like, okay, let's stick the next piece of the puzzle in here. Let's stir it up some more. Like he didn't discover that. He got a phone call to look at this new name, right?
That's
from
right.
the Pentagon.
Yeah, and from his contact, he had a very, he said, impeccable contact there. That's right. So there's a lot of these names floating around apparently, and it's almost like one of those you know, limited hangouts. A little bit of a limited hangout in the sense like you put something out there, but information that you're able to run away from.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I'd say that's the basic thing, because
Yeah.
if you look at when John Greenwald checks with Major Harris at the Public Affairs Office in the Pentagon, she says no, it's aviation. That is the name of the program. So about a week and a half ago, you remember Washington Post did another story on the whole TTSA thing, and they used aerospace. So I immediately contacted the reporter and I said, okay, your original story used aviation. Now you're using aerospace. Why have you changed the term? And he said, well, it's a good question. He said, my contacts with the Pentagon, they're telling me aerospace. So you got the Pentagon.
Yeah, that
telling
doesn't
the
really
Washington
answer the question.
And so what do you think is actually going on? I mean, you've played with a lot of these players, like Putoff. I know Putoff, and
Yeah.
I know Davis, and I've known all these guys for many years. In fact, a lot of these players, whether it's Alexander and stuff, these guys have been in these programs in and out. It's Bill Moore, it's John's group for the group that he had, the UFO working group. There's all these,
Right.
NIDS.
Yeah.
These guys just cycle through. So what's your interpretation of why these guys are involved? What's actually going on?
Well, I can speak, having spoken with Hal Putoff for a number of years, my assessment of him really hasn't changed. It's that he's sincere. I believe he has integrity. I actually firmly believe this. I believe he's someone who is doing his best to, let's say, work his way through the system, work his way through the labyrinth. I'm not convinced that he's reached the center of the maze. I think that he strikes me as someone who knows a lot and has a lot that's confirmed to him for sure. But whether he's one of the most inside of like an MJ-12 type of a person, I just don't think that's the case. So I think that there's access that he still probably would like. That's my sense. I don't know this, so I'm just giving my impression. And that he seems firmly to believe in the desirability, let's say, of ending the bulk of the secrecy on UFOs. I think that he believes that. I think he genuinely believes that. Someone like Alexander, no idea what that man thinks. I just can't figure him out. I've had arguments with him, debates over the years, and at one point he debated with me that there was no UFO cover-up. I'm like, how can you possibly believe that and maintain any credibility? So I can't figure him out. I don't know if he's intentionally deceptive or he's just dense.
There's actually a question where Putoff is asked a question about John Alexander. I'll let you read it. It's pretty funny how he answers it. But it is true. I mean, John always made the claim that there's individual interest, but there's not institutional interest. And you don't know how the government works if you think there's
there's no such thing as special access programs or black budgets. I mean, come on.
And then suddenly the program comes out. Now, I would like to know what he says now. And I think what he's saying now is, why so little? But then you go to the political thing where Politicals was told, well, there's more than one program. This is just one of the programs.
Exactly. And indeed, we would want to ask, why so little? $22 million over 5 years. And for the Pentagon, that's nothing. That's less than nothing practically. So, on the other hand, $22 million is still significant for most of us for something that wasn't supposed to exist at all. The fact that they spent anything on it is interesting. So, but there's a lot of interesting issues here as far as like what the members of TTSA, like Hal Putoff and people like Eric Davis, who I think is associated with the TTSA, isn't he? And then Chris Mellon and Elizondo, like, what are their actual goals? I mean, not having the opportunity for detailed conversations with them about this, I can only speculate. I mean, my feeling is that they are part of that little invisible college that we talked about before. These are, some of the guys in the aviary. That is the informal group of people going way, way back for years who have had various types of intersection with a UFO subject in their professional career. Yeah. They're all part of that same little club, and they like to talk to each other about that. But that's what the aviary was. The aviary wasn't a major conspiracy that was a government.
That's the way it's become.
So ridiculous.
Yeah, especially when you know them. Like you and I have interacted with these people when you know them. Like another one is Kit Green. When you've interacted with these people, absolutely, these are people who are just like down the rabbit hole the same as you and I and trying to figure this thing out and are trying to use their contacts
right
to figure out what's going on.
Yeah, that's it. It's like I've never now Kit Green's a little different because he was pretty high level with the CIA, briefed Ronald Reagan on things, and he's knows a lot of powerful people, perhaps more than most of the other people in that crowd. But the real question is how much of a power players are these fellows? I mean, I don't really get the idea that any of them are at the highest level of power, within the system. They're successful and brilliant, frequently people who, like you said, they're gone down the rabbit hole like we have. They definitely have information that
we don't have.
They don't share. Yeah, that's definitely the case. Like the few conversations I had with Hal and also with Kit Green, I've talked with him. They're both very precise types of people, and they both make it very clear that they're not telling you everything they know. At least with me.
Yeah. It's an interesting situation. And why do you think they have joined up with DeLong's operation? What do you think that whole thing is about?
I've been really, it's good because when we were at Contact in the Desert a week ago, I was really happy to get a chance to chat with Peter Levenda. And I don't know if you've ever chatted with Peter Levenda yet.
No.
You would like him very much. He's I've known him since 2011, and Peter really became known primarily as an expert on the Nazis and their interest in the occult, and he wrote a number of books on that theme. And I've always felt he has absolute integrity and is a very, very good researcher as well. And when in talking with him about TTSA, he he knows Tom DeLonge reasonably well and knows a lot of the guys in TTSA, even though he's not an explicit member of TTSA. I mean, he made it clear to me. Mm-hmm. Why do they hook up with Tom DeLonge? To hear Peter talk about it, it was all Tom DeLonge's initiative. It's not like the spooks sought him out, said, "Oh yeah, this is someone we can use," just like we used Bill Moore or Paul Benowitz years ago, like Mirage Men type of a thing. Like there's a lot of people who have this concept about DeLonge that he's a useful idiot. I hear this all the time, that he's a tool. I hear Jimmy Church now saying this. I hear other people saying it, and I've never come to this specific conclusion. I've always held provisional thoughts on this. I mean, is DeLonge being worked? Is he not being worked? I mean, one of the things that you can say is that because he cultivated these military people, he certainly was not like Stephen Greer would say, they're evil, they're doing the cover up. They're like DeLonge really has an opposite sort of approach to it, and he really is very sympathetic to the military. So I think that's jarring, to a lot of people who are following this from the outside. Like, why are you sucking up to the military? I think is a big question that people have. But Levenda pointed out to me that, look, DeLonge's motivation was he wanted to get information out of them. He wanted them to work with him. And you're not really going to get them to work with you by calling them out on unethical cover-ups and the like. So I get that. If I'm to take Peter Levenda's insight, because I think he has a better perspective than I do on this, his very strong take on it is that DeLonge did the footwork. It's his show. He's promoting this. He's pushing this, and he gained the confidence of a lot of these people, and they just said, this just might work. So that's Levenda. Barring any other kind of document release or inside information, I don't really know how else to interpret it. There's claims that they sought him out at some barbecue, from what I've heard, and
that's my interpretation. Yeah.
And maybe that's so. Maybe that's so. But I would want to see the evidence for that. Like I don't know if that's the full story or if there's something else that's behind that.
Yeah, I can give you that chain. Of how he went from one person to another. But I'd like to ask you a question about Peter. Remember, we were on the disclosure panel there, and Peter said we don't have all the videos, which I'd sort of thought that they had all these videos, and that
as did I.
And remember, he said we're waiting for the government to give us some more stuff, or how we would put it. We're waiting for them to declassify and give us the next piece of evidence, which sort of indicated and so have you got any ideas? Who's the government? Who are they talking about? Who's actually behind
I don't know,
this
but what I will tell you what I did hear from another source, which was that Elizondo had more than 3 videos. All right, so that he had at least 6. So there's 3 others that he is in possession of. Now, it's very likely that those other 3 videos are classified and he is not permitted to release them. But to say that TTSA doesn't have any more videos than 3, I would question that, because I think
or the idea that they're waiting for the government to give them some more stuff, which sort of struck me as if, like, wow, that's
that might be inaccurate. It might just be that they've got them, but they don't have authorization to release them, which I would think is probably more likely the case. Like Elizondo would be a guy who would have the security classification, presumably, to see some of these videos, so he would have them.
But does he still have a security clearance? That's another big question. Did he retire? Is he still in the game?
I don't know.
Like, who's the government? Who's actually doing the releasing? Have you got any ideas who that might be?
I don't know. No, I don't.
Yeah.
And in fact, when I was talking with Peter about this at one point or another, there are a couple of things where he was definitely not coming out explicitly to say one way or the other. So, and it doesn't mean that he's, being sneaky. It just means that he just may not be at liberty. I don't know. My sense is that there's still a lot going on here that we don't know. But it doesn't necessarily mean it's something nefarious. I'm not willing to go down that path just yet. I want to get a little more information. I do think, what they've done. I'm so far willing to say I think what they've done is a net positive for the UFO research field. I believe it. I don't think it's. I'm not comfortable with calling it disinformation. I think the New York Times and Washington Post engage in disinformation, and I think the New York Times coverage in particular was really sneaky, actually, and also very propagandistic. And I'll just give you a case in point. Like in the main article, "Glowing Auras, Black Budgets, and Pentagon's Mysterious UFO Program." I mean, even the title itself is borderline sensationalistic.
Yeah, and it wasn't black money.
No, it wasn't exactly. But also in that article, first of all, they had 2 utterly gratuitous statements by skeptics, including James Oberg. I mean, are you kidding me? I mean, they had nothing to add to the article, but they just they trot out these 2 debunkers who had nothing to add substantively to the article, but they really served as just intellectual placeholders for skeptics, as if to say, don't get too excited here, people. But then the other thing that they talked about were the metal alloys that Bigelow Aerospace supposedly had, when in fact what we're hearing explicitly is that they're not actually metal alloys. They're meta materials. Very different.
Yeah.
Very different. And so what I've been wanting to know is, how did metal alloys creep into that article? Because that's misinformation. It's actually wrong. And I asked someone who knew Elizondo and was told it wasn't Elizondo who said that. So if that's true, how did the New York Times piece, was written by Ralph Blumenthal, Helene Cooper, and Leslie Kean, how did it get in there? And I don't know. I'll have a chance hopefully to ask Leslie Kean at some point this year. I think I'll run into her. And I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just like, I want to know, like, how did this happen? Because that's not, from what I'm understanding, how it went down. So in other words, there's things in that New York Times piece. And then they said the Pentagon program ended in 2012, which, no, doesn't seem to have ended. Not at all. I heard from Lavenda that Elizondo actually worked in the ATIP program right up to 2017. It didn't end in 2012. So, in other words, what the New York Times piece did is it sort of took the air. I mean, it gave a lot of information, absolutely, but it also took some of the wind out of the sails as well. And I feel that was intentional.
Do you think they were avoiding the UFO community? That was, I think, it was actually, confirmed by Lavenda.
Oh, yeah.
And that I had said before, that it's not directed at us because, you and I will pick up this inconsistency and that one. And
well, we're going to
look
nitpick
like
it to death. And then plus they put out this Mylar balloon, which was, oh my God, what a gaffe. No, Lavenda's point, and again, I'm not going to argue against his point here. Right? I mean, it's a legitimate point, is that he says, look, we're not really here to talk to the UFO researchers. We're here to talk to the mainstream. Right. We want to change the tenor of the conversation in the establishment media, and that is the New York Times first and foremost.
Do you think that worked?
A little bit, yeah. I do think it worked a little bit. I think that in the aftermath of that, you have CNN, you have Fox, you got Tucker Carlson doing actually a really good interview with David Fravor. Yeah. About as, I mean, there's so much that the mainstream has not followed up on. And this is why I think the establishment media, I mean, why do we even listen to these guys? They're dinosaurs. They're so utterly irrelevant and so propagandistic. And I don't think, there has been a change generally in the approach toward UFOs, and it is from that New York Times piece specifically, and the Post and Politico. But then you look at the establishment media. There's no follow-up in any meaningful way other than George Knapp. And he's sort of, yes, he's establishment, but he's also not big establishment. He's like regional establishments, and I think there's a difference. So from the national establishment, there's been no follow-up on Bigelow's alleged possession of recovered materials. Like, that's interesting. Yeah. We're talking potential crash retrievals, at least potentially. Why has no one gone in and asked Robert Bigelow this? No self-examination of these same journalists as to why for so many years they've been dismissive of UFOs. I mean, to the point of being snarky, like the Washington Post.
Yeah.
No follow-up of Elizondo's point, which is like, why did my superiors not seem to care about all of these unbelievable sightings? And no implications of the Fravor Tic Tac incident. Like, that is so important. That one incident by itself has incredible, not just national security implications, but like science and technology and existential implications, and nothing. So I don't see that media as seriously looking into this. They dropped a little seed, is what they did, and they basically just ran away from it. And they're waiting maybe for the next little seed to drop. I mean, if they wanted a disclosure moment, they could have used the Tic Tac incident, in my view, to provide a serious disclosure moment. And clearly it's not happening.
Yeah. I always saw it as like they're going after the swing voters. They're really not, trying to convince the people who are already voting. Do you think it's constitutional? Do you think what they're doing is legal and constitutional?
I think the idea of a black budget is inherently unconstitutional. So,
but I'm saying the TTSA, like they put off in these guys, would they get in it? Is there rules and regulations as to what's going on here?
Well, I don't know that TTSA has done anything that's in violation of the law. I mean, I'm not aware of anything that they've done that would be unconstitutional.
But in terms of dropping the information, like say if the government is giving them documents, like that's my question is always, how are they getting the videos out into the public? Because there's millions of videos that have since 1947.
Yeah.
How are they doing this? How do you get around the Constitution and the law in doing what they're doing in dropping this material into a private, whether it's Bigelow or Tom DeLonge's operation? How are they doing this legally and constitutionally?
Well, I mean, officially speaking, it's the Pentagon that's doing the declassification of these videos. So, they use contractors all the time to get their projects done. I mean, Pentagon's used Lockheed and Boeing and Raytheon and General Dynamics and others for years and years and years that have had, workers with as high or higher security clearances than Pentagon employees themselves. So, I mean, that's nothing new. I mean, the question is using contractors at all constitutional? And I guess that's for lawyers to work out. But I think for me, the issue is it constitutional to have unauthorized spending on a phenomenon that is in the public interest and that people need to know about? And I don't know about the ATIP program itself being unconstitutional, but I think I am convinced that the ATIP program is the tip of the iceberg. I think there's way more. No one's going to convince me at this point that $22 million over 5 years is the sum total of what they've spent on examining the most important scientific and military phenomenon that we're dealing with these days, and that is UFOs. There's just no way in hell they're spending only $22 million for 5 years.
Yeah, and that comes to back to this. This program with remote viewing. The other guy that was in the room was Dick D'Amato, and you remember the testimony that was given at Citizens Hearing by Jesse Marcel Jr. that he tapped on the Majestic book and said this isn't fiction. He tells Jesse Marcel,
there's
a deep, and he was in this remote viewing thing as well. He was doing the working for the Senate Appropriations Committee. He was, because they were doing budgeting stuff for the remote viewing. So he was in the room. So he brings this up as well, this idea. And there's one researcher who's actually now talking. And I mean, he's still talking about this. He just discussed it, at how this operation works, of how you've got this sort of public thing where it's not responsible to the government with the money and that kind of stuff.
Well, yeah, and Dick D'Amato is powerful for years and years, highest level Defense Department. I mean, look, the rule of law, I think, has been thrown out the window in so many ways by the U.S. government for years and years and years. And the UFO phenomenon, in my view, has been one of the core reasons for that. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the key reasons that the United States government in itself, in a way, has gone rogue since the 1940s. That is, if you've got a phenomenon that is so important, so powerful, so valuable as UFOs. I mean, if any kind of crash retrievals from the 40s and onward would be of unbelievable value. So they want to explore that. They want to study that. And I can understand that. But what it does is it forces the whole system to go black and to go underground, as it were. You can't tell Congress about it, and so that you've got to get money to pay for it, and you can't tell Congress about it. So by its very nature, it creates a black budget culture that by its very nature undermines the rule of law in the United States, and by extension, other nations too that get wrapped up with it. I mean, you're in Canada. Canadians are intimately involved in the U.S. national security apparatus, and they, I'm sure, break their own legalities, break their own laws in pursuance of this secret as well. There's just secrecies worldwide. Yeah. It's a cancer.
Wow. Okay, we got less than a minute. I've got one last question. You were married by Catherine Austin Fitz. Did you talk to her about this encounter she had with John Peterson, the aliens among us? Did you discuss that sort of stuff?
Not on this occasion. I talked with Catherine about that on other occasions, and she absolutely stands by it. Late 1990s. She was in her own enemy of the state phase, just like Denzel Washington in the movie. Yeah. People can read about it. And at that time, she was approached by John Peterson of the Arlington Institute, very powerful guy, who was connected with Greer earlier, who said, yes, how would you like to meet an alien? We have in the Navy, we've got, we're talking about a future in which aliens are openly described as walking among us. Would you like to meet an alien? And she wrote later, this is the only time in my career that I regretted a decision to learn something new. I could have learned it, but she was afraid that she was being set up. Wow. So I didn't talk with her about it this one time, but we have talked about it on other occasions.
You're a wealth of information, Richard. Thank you for the conversation. And let's do it again. And I'll see you in Vancouver and in Toronto, and we're going to have dinner, I think, maybe.
Well, I'm going to be following you around.
Okay. Thank you, Richard. I'll send it back.
You've been listening to The Cameron Files with Grant Cameron.